The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
The Himalayas are a source of many of the planet's largest rivers, providing 1 billion people with water for drinking, agriculture, sanitation and more. Yet today, the region is facing a water crisis. Climate change is affecting Himalayan glaciers. Increased demand, inefficient management, unequal distribution, and overexploitation of groundwater resources have left the region confronting serious water insecurity. To discuss these and related issues, please join our live panel of experts, bringing your questions, comments and challenges. The event will broadcast live on all social media channels of the Democracy Forum on Wednesday 22nd of June 2022, 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. UK time.
Hello and good afternoon to those of you here with me in Britain. Good evening to those of you in South Asia, and welcome everyone wherever you are in the world. I know that we have one in Washington, D.C. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next couple of hours for this fascinating Democracy Forum debate, Impending Himalayan Water Crisis, Causes and Effects. It is that subtitle which is so important: melting glaciers, reduced snowfall, increasing population, water scarcity, and water rivalry. What will be the effect and impact of all of this? There's far too little discussion on these matters, which is why the Democracy Forum has brought these issues to the fore today. With us to dissect, drill down and debate, we have a 6-member panel, each giving a 10-minute presentation. Paromita Ghosh, Anil Kulkarni, Dipak Gyawali, Aditi Mukherji, Dhondup Wangmo, and Charles Iceland. Now, because of unpredictable schedules, we're veering from our usual format, and summing up will be the Democracy Forum President, Lord Charles Bruce, and laying out the canvas for our discussion today is Democracy Forum Chairman Barry Gardiner MP, who has pre-recorded a short video.
Thank you, Humphrey, and welcome to this fascinating discussion. Today we bring together some of the world's most complex natural phenomena as we look at climate change and its effects on freshwater systems, with some of the world's most complex geopolitical problems as we look at the tense relationships that exist between the countries that depend upon the Hindu-Kush Himalaya. We're talking about the political relationships between Afghanistan, Pakistan, China, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Myanmar. The mountain ranges that stretch across Asia's water tower include not only the Himalayas themselves, but the Pamir, the Karakoram, and the Tian Shan mountain ranges. They're sometimes referred to as the third pole because they contain the world's largest amount of ice and snow anywhere outside of the North and South poles themselves. They have some 54,000 glaciers And those glaciers feed Asia's key river systems, the Mekong, the Indus, the Amu Darya, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Irrawaddy, the Yangtze, the Salween, and the Yellow River. I said they feed the river systems, but they also feed and water approximately 1.9 billion people whose agriculture and energy depends upon them. These rivers traverse multiple countries, often across contested national boundaries, and they face rising stresses in terms of both demand and supply. On the demand side, the rising population in Asia is seeing water use increase dramatically, with greater agricultural production, increasing urbanization, rising industrial production, and intensive dam building to supply energy through hydropower. But this is compounded on the supply side by the threat of climate change. A warmer climate is melting those 54,000 glaciers that are the source of the rivers. Those glaciers have been in continuous retreat since 1970, and it's important to understand that because climate rises faster at high altitude, even if the world meets the Paris goal of keeping to 1.5 degrees, that global average of 1.5 could see a 2.1 degree rise in the Hindu Kush Himalayas. In this scenario, those glaciers will lose 36% of their current volume, as this warmer climate shifts patterns of precipitation and there's less snow to balance the glacier melt. Those changes, along with the higher temperatures themselves, will have significant impacts on food production, energy production, and of course the unique wildlife in one of the world's most biodiverse regions. Of the 240 million people who actually live in the HKH and depend directly on its resources, 1/3 already live below the poverty line, and a half face some form of malnutrition. So the threat to agricultural production immediately becomes a political issue. There are perhaps two recent important studies that have focused the world's attention on the problems in the past few years: the Hindu Kush Himalaya Assessment and Ecology Meets Geopolitics, that's water in Himalaya Asia. Both of these show that the Himalayan rivers are projected initially to swell and then by mid-century to experience diminished flow. Ecologists and environmental scientists calculate that the new dam projects have not taken climate change adequately into account in their calculations of river flow, of silt loads, and of energy potential. And dams also threaten to intensify flooding downstream during intense downpours when the reservoirs overflow. But it's the transboundary nature of the region's water resources that creates the potential for serious political and security impacts. A recent policy briefing published in the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis looks at cooperation and joint investments in the Indus Basin. It concludes that achieving sustainable development in the Indus Basin will strongly depend on the capacity of riparian countries to realize the opportunities that arise when joint investments across sectors and countries are embraced. Now, I suspect some of our eminent panelists may think this a rather hopeful assessment of the potential for political partnership in the region. They may conclude that Himalayan Asia's transboundary water dynamics, rather than becoming the locus of international cooperation, have the capacity to propel countries into even greater conflict because of water insecurity, and rather than aiding interstate cooperation, will actually threaten to exacerbate it. Never forget that because China controls the Tibetan plateau, it controls the headwaters of transboundary rivers that stretch across all the 4 regions of Himalayan Asia: East, Central, South, and Southeast Asia. Yet its own needs as a country are huge. Within East Asia, China has a limited water supply and a gargantuan water demand. It has a severe internal water imbalance between its drier, thirstier north and its wetter south. And on the demand side, China's booming economy and expanding population have placed its surface and groundwater sources under extreme pressure. On the supply side, it's developed some of the world's largest hydro projects. Now, hydrologically, China is upstream of nearly everyone else, giving it a commanding position. Other countries, of course, also enjoy upstream positions, India being upstream of both Pakistan and Bangladesh. This hydrological asymmetry is matched by geopolitical asymmetry, with China possessing outsized power. China refuses to participate in multilateral forums surrounding transport boundary water use. Instead, it negotiates through bilateral economic diplomacy, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, where it holds the whip hand. China and India compete indirectly for influence among their South and Southeast Asian neighbors, with transboundary waters occasionally part of the mix. They share one critical river, the Brahmaputra. India's existential fear is that China will someday divert the river northward. And China, of course, also views India's intentions through a national security lens and sees India as a security threat. India's plans to dam the Brahmaputra tributary rivers in the Arunachal Pradesh pose a particular threat to China. But the two countries have no formal mechanism for resolving their disagreements. Hydrodiplomacy is also central to the bilateral relationship between India and Pakistan. The Indus Water Treaty has survived many periods of conflict in Indian-Pakistan relations, but it's highly questionable as to whether it's comprehensive enough or malleable enough to deal with novel challenges such as climate-driven changes in Indus water levels. The deep wells of distrust and suspicion within both countries about the other's motivations and behaviors continue to strain relations over the Indus. China, India, and Pakistan all claim to overlapping pieces of territory running along the mountainous regions that the three countries share borders with, and that form important portions of their transboundary watersheds. When problems of water supply come, and climate change makes it inevitable that they will come, then national governments may find it easier to blame their aggressive neighbor rather than to engage constructively beforehand to minimize the damaging impact to everyone. So, is conflict inevitable? The intense pressure and increasing demand for water, coupled with the impact of climate change on supply, will almost certainly give rise to internal domestic political stress. Whether that moves into international blame shifting and outright hot conflict with bordering states, or is constrained by hydrodiplomatic breakthroughs in transboundary cooperation, coupled with better governance and sharing of data on flood warnings and climate risk, it's now for our esteemed expert panelists to tell us.
Detailed of what we're dealing with today, from hydrodiplomacy to deep wells of distrust. Our first speaker is Paromita Ghosh from the National Institute of Himalayan Environment, who has worked in the region for more than 20 years. She is going to lay out for us the challenges posed by the changing environment there. Paromita Ghosh, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Humphrey. Am I audible? Please be on the first slide. First slide, the introductory slide. Yeah. Respected President, the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, Chair, Barry Gardiner, MP, London, Humphrey Hawksley, BBC correspondent, Charles Iceland, and other invited panelists and audience across the globe. It is a pleasure to get an opportunity to speak on the topic, Impending Himalayan Water Crisis, Causes and Effects. To begin with, I'm a forest ecologist by training from Banaras Hindu University, Varanasi, India, and I'm working in the Indian Himalayan region for the past 22 years. Based on my institute's requirement, I worked on land and water resource management for a decade, and presently I'm working in the Center for Socio-Economic Development of the Institute. Therefore, I will restrict myself on the ecological and socio-economic perspectives of the impending Himalayan water crisis, causes and effects. Thank you. Next. The Himalayas give rise to the major rivers, making it a crucial ecological buffer. Apart from the Arctic and the Antarctic poles, it is the region where maximum water is stored in the form of ice and snow, and hence it is popularly known as the third pole. The Himalayan river basin is home to approximately 1.3 billion people and supply water, food, and energy to more than 3 billion people. Hence, it is also known as the water tower of Asia. The Indian Himalayan region is governed by the monsoon pattern of rainfall, which creates a distinct rainy season from July to September, when there is enough and often surplus water in the region. But during summer and winter season, there is acute scarcity of water, and therefore the region confronts a too much and too little water syndrome. Next. The Himalayas provide 8.6 million cubic meter water annually. It provides water for drinking, irrigation, generation of hydroelectric power, and other uses for about 1.5 billion people. The Himalayas produce the world's largest renewable supplies of fresh water. It gives rise to a unique mix of subtropical, tropical, and alpine vegetation, and is a biodiversity hotspot with a huge flora and fauna unique to the region. The Himalayan waters have given birth to distinct cultural, religious, and social way of life. It has cradled ancient civilizations. Until date, it supports some of the most densely populated region on the earth. Next. The Himalayan forests and vegetations play a major role in water availability. The forests cause rain, and some areas they account for most of the annual rainfall. The vegetation acts like a sponge, soaking up and storing rainwater and releasing it later gradually through springs and aquifers. The sponging effect of the forest is largely because of the organic matter generated by the above ground and below ground litter, pores, tunnels, and slits created by dead roots and soil fauna. The forests decrease the soil erosion and filter pollutants from water. Consequently, it improves the turbine working and helps in generating more hydropower. In a study carried in the 1990s, it was observed that it is better to protect the forests to improve the water quality than install the water purification plant. This is, of course, not a study from the Himalayas, but from New York. The people of New York City decided to spend $1.4 billion to protect the 32-kilometer square Catskill watershed, and this helped in saving $4.6 billion, the cost of constructing new water treatment plants, and $300 million as annual operational costs. Unfortunately, such comparative studies in the Himalayan region on the ecosystem services provided by the Himalayas versus the man-made services are lacking and needs to be done. The sooner, the better. Scientific studies from the Indian Himalayan region has also reported that forest types also play a major role in the hydrology. Broadleaf forests are considered more efficient in water infiltration and in controlling the soil erosions compared to the conifers. In the western Himalayas, the oak and pine dominate, and oak forests are considered more valuable even by the locals, as well as scientific validation has also proved that oaks are better than the pines. Next. Now let us look at the natural and man-made causes of the Himalayan water crisis. The climate change is affecting the hydrology of the region. like seasonal extremes of increased evapotranspiration, changes in glacier volumes, increase in runoff, altering rainfall pattern, soil moisture, humidity, glacier mass balance, river flow, and causes change in underground water sources. Floods and droughts are occurring at higher frequency and intensity. Studies conducted by the Indian Space Research Organization shows that approximately 75% of the Himalayan glaciers are retreating at an alarming rate. The faster pace of the glacier melt is leading to more water in the rivers initially, but once the glaciers sink, the water shortage will be experienced. Deforestation is leading to cloudbursts, flash floods, and massive landslides. Thus, the interconnectedness of water and forest cover has a huge impact on the water sustainability of the mountain cities and towns. The water supports a plethora of flora and fauna. The water crisis arising out of decreasing forest cover is also decreasing the survival rate of floras and faunas, and therefore shrinking the natural biodiversity of the region. Extensive forests can cycle moisture between land and atmosphere, so decrease in forest cover has negative impact on the regional hydrological cycle. The decline in forest cover is preventing the formation of glaciers and snow and decrease the water flow in rivers. The Himalayan mountains are young fold mountains and highly susceptible to landslides and erosion. The Ganga-Brahmaputra rivers carry heavy sediment load, which is increasing more by day due to deforestation. Massive ecological disturbances have been brought about by the hydropower projects, many of which are poorly constructed. Building road network, concrete structures, forest fires are also contributing towards the water crisis. Water scarcity is an outcome of the physical and economic mechanism. The economic measures involve anthropogenic contribution towards water shortage, which includes poor water resource management, land use change or landscape alterations, sedimentation, water pollution, and urbanization. Loss or lack of social, cultural, and religious value for water in changing the human personality is also creating the water crisis. Unprecedented population growth, rapid urbanization, expansion of infrastructures, migration, land conversion cause changes in flux, pathways, and storage of water. Next. Now, looking at the scenario of the water situation in the Himalayan towns, the scarcity is largely due to poor management of spring shed, the distribution lines, lack of rainwater harvesting, and overexploitation of the groundwater. Concrete structures have reduced water infiltration in the towns where water supply is mostly from the springs. The springs are drying up due to concrete load, also resulting in low river water level, as these springs also contribute to the base flow of the Himalayan rivers. Lowering infiltration has also resulted in overflowing river banks and urban drains. Next. These are some of the facts to worry about. 90% of the Uttarakhand population are dependent on the natural springs, which have been accounted to be around 2.6 lakhs, according to a UNDP report. Almora town had 300 springs 3 decades ago, but now it is left with only 50 active springs. The study reports a spring discharge in Garhwal Himalayan region have also decreased by 75%. Water is sold at the rate of 20 to 25 rupees per container, approximately 20 liters in summer. Every day, a woman has to travel 4 to 5 kilometers to trek and spend 2 to 4 hours fetching a pail of water for her rural household. Availability of potable water during the summer drops due to low, it goes to 25 to 30 liters per capita, which is half of the World Health Organization standards. Next. Now, the effects of the water scarcity, the major impact is faced by the agriculture. Mountain agriculture has always been rain-fit, and due to persistent water crisis, it is almost in the verge of extinction, and people are migrating to the plains in search of better livelihood. This is leading to food insecurity and human conflicts for food and water. Therefore, protecting the Himalayan water resources and its sustainable use should be given utmost importance. Severe water crisis in the hill towns happen during the peak summer tourist season when people from the plains rush to the hills to get respite from the summer heat. But water crisis is now impacting the tourism and related livelihood. When it comes to the agriculture part, a scientific report has been reported that there is a decrease in apple yield in the Himalayan region due to inadequate winter chilling. And this has been also validated. There is subsidence of the agricultural land is also taking place due to building of roads and blasting for hydropower projects. And then the worst is still to come. The debris that are generated are dumped into the rivers and choking them and creating lakes and flash floods. So apart from consumption, use and water quality and quantity is also influencing the recreational and other livelihoods like fishing, boating, and rafting. Lack of easy and regular access to clean water is also giving room to more cases of waterborne diseases. Women and child drudgery is increasing as they have to fetch water for household consumption from long distances, as we saw in the earlier slide. Next. The way forward, the lack of knowledge and awareness in understanding the glaciers, springs, and aquifers are leading to incorrect water budgeting. Therefore, there is a need to create a curricula in simple language and create local change leaders who will have knowledge of hydrological cycling in their region and will be able to motivate people in participatory conservation and management of the Himalayan waters. A huge campaign for spring rejuvenation has already been started for alleviating the rural water scarcity. Work has also been initiated by various sectors on creation of spring inventory and development and implementation of spring revival model through participatory action. A separate local watershed action plan has also been floated to counter drought, intense rainfall, and other water-related natural calamities and make climate-smart villages and towns. Capacity building in water resource management has also been intensified across the Indian Himalayan region. Our Honorable Prime Minister launched a new initiative, Mission Amrit Sarovar, in April this year, which is aimed at reviving and rejuvenating 75 water bodies in each district of the country as a part of the celebration of 75 years of India's independence, which is now being celebrated as Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. Other government initiatives are Mission Jal Jeevan, Ghar Ghar Jal, and Namami Gange, that is dedicated to save the river Ganges. Development of low-cost water purification system with added minerals with help of nanotechnology, that is production of graphene and plastic waste, has been successfully commercialized to protect the Himalayan water bodies from plastic pollution and purify the water. This has been done in Kumaon University by Professor Nandagopal Sahu. Runoff water conservation through digging trenches, infiltration holes, building check dams with pine needles, and afforestation is also being done. The Himalayan rivers also fall in the transboundary jurisdiction, as already said by Parry, and therefore understanding the geography, political relationships, including the power relationships, economics, and cultural histories of nation states, sharing the water is important to create management strategies and collaborative transboundary governance of water. Thus, the Himalayan water crisis needs a multi-pronged approach wherein blending the socio-cultural and ecological aspect with hydrology will yield a better tomorrow. Next. Thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Paromita. Ghosh, very much for that very detailed element, concluding the multi-pronged approach needed to begin to resolve this crisis. We are now going on to Anil Kulkarni from the Divecha Center for Climate Change in the Indian Institute of Science, one of India's foremost experts on glaciers, and he's going to tell us about the Himalayan cryosphere. Cryosphere is the frozen water element, correct me if I'm wrong, over the Earth's surface, and that is melting at the moment, which is stuff out of science fiction movies. Anil Kulkarni, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Humphrey, and thank you very much for inviting me to have this talk. So I will today talk about Himalayan cryosphere under warm climate and how it is going to affect the water security of the subcontinent. So we will discuss some of these issues. So we already know that in Himalayas, there are various mountain ranges. And we move from southern side, there's the Pir Panjal mountain range, then Great Himalayan mountain range, then Ladakh and Karakoram mountain ranges. Try to remember some of the locations because later on when we talk about the glacier retreat, some of these geographical locations may be of some importance. So we already know that Himalayan region is substantially warming up as compared to the global mean as well as compared to the peninsular India. The recent work which is carried out in Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology suggests that in the early 50s and 60s, the Himalayan region was much more cooler than the Indian subcontinent. But since the 80s, the temperature started to warm. And then the Himalayan region has become much more warmer as compared to the Indian subcontinent. So suggesting that as we move higher into the atmosphere, either they're going to be enhanced cooling effect or they're going to be enhanced the temperature rising warming effect. So Himalayan right now is warming much more faster rate than the most of the globe as a continent. In addition to that, the work which is carried out by some of the government agencies suggests that there is a significant increase in the proportion of rainfall and there's a decrease in the snowfall. There is no substantial change in the amount of precipitation, but the contribution as snowfall has decreased and contribution of rainfall has a little bit gone up. And all of these are affecting the Himalayan glacier. So we have, even though Himalaya has thousands of glaciers, we have approximately 150 glaciers for which people have gone into the field, carried out the scientific investigation and tried to understand how much is the glacial retreat. So if you look into the Brahmaputra, Ganga and Indus, lower Indus basin, you will realize approximately 15 to 16 meters per annum is the rate of Himalayan glacier. But you go up into the Karakoram, which is the northernmost region of the Himalaya, suggesting that rate of retreat is substantially lower than that. So what it also means is Himalayan region has a different amount of glacial loss and it has a differential loss of glacial retreat also. So we will discuss some of the implications of that. But before going into the glacier, let us talk about the seasonal snow cover. Himalaya has a huge amount of seasonal snow cover, and in the winter time, approximately 1.5 million square kilometer area is covered by glaciers, and there's a large variability in the snow cover as winter progresses and summer comes. Almost 85% of geographical area is reduced to 10%, which is under snow cover. So therefore, there is an issue when it comes to the observational program to understand whether Himalayan glacier snow cover is retreating or not. But we will not go into that scientific part. But let us look into some of these. So there's definitely change in the snow accumulation and abrasion pattern. And what has really started to happen is in various regions of Himalayas, snow has started to melt quite early. It means in the in the March itself, substantial amount of February, March itself, substantial amount of snow has started to melt. And because of that, there is also early forest fire seasons. Forest fire season has slightly changed. And now we are in the spring season itself. We have forest fire. Generally, we have forest fire in summer, but now we have forest fire in spring, and which is influencing snow melt, because a lot of black carbon which is generated because of the forest fire falls on the glaciers as well as seasonal snow, and which enhances the snow and glacier melt. In addition to that, there's a lot of winter tourism is taking place into the India in these days. So the combination of forest fire and tourism is causing to change snow albedo, and early melting of snow. Snow is taking place. As the influence of that, you can see it here is that there's a lot of mountain streams or mountain springs are becoming now dry. So there's a lot of vulnerability of the mountain spring. And earlier speaker was talking about there are so many mountain springs have become dry. So you can see in this slide over here is that how snow is melting in the middle of winter. This is a low altitude basin, Ravi Basin into the Himalayas. And you can see here that even in the middle of winter, there's a substantial melting of seasonal snow is taking place. So all this region is causing snow to melt early, and it is also influencing the springs into the Himalaya. Let us look into the glaciers. We already discussed that Intogwish Himalaya is approximately 60,000 square kilometer area under the glaciers, and these three basins, Indus, Ganga, and Brahmaputra, has approximately 40,000 square kilometer area. And you can see here that overall 3,200 gigaton is water stored into that. But you also have to understand that many of that glaciers are now started to retreat in much faster rate, as well as many of these glaciers are losing mass very fast. If you look into this figure, you can see wherever there is a red, which suggests that glaciers are losing almost a meter. And what it really means is there are many glaciers which are located in low altitude, whose size is very small, is losing mass at much higher rate than those who are located in very high altitude glacier, high altitude region. Obvious results that numerous mountain communities, because we have to realize one thing, that nobody settles around the big mountains, nobody settles around the big glaciers. And because of that, most of the people are settled around small glaciers. And this is one of the examples at the Como village in Spiti Valley. You can see here is that there's a small glacier there, and there's adjacent village, and which is receiving water because of the melting of these glaciers. Remember, these are reasonably prosperous communities because they have very high-end agriculture. They produce the agriculture, which is the seed gate in Spiti Basin, and that is extremely high demand globally. So that is a reasonably prosperous community. But climate change is going to change now that the water system, which is right now available, may not work in future. That does not mean that community will not have access to the water, but it means the additional investment is needed to make sure that this community remains economically viable. But let us look into the bigger picture, because until now we were talking about the communities which is living into the mountains. But there are a large number of people, as it was said earlier, more than 1 million people depend upon the water which is generated into the Himalaya, and therefore it is called the water tower of this region. So you can see here that how much is contribution of snow and glacier melt into the stream runoff, and it is varying. It is varying because where you are measuring. If you are if you go toward the Indus Basin and very high altitude, you can say it has more than 75% of water which is coming from the snow and glacier melt. As you come towards the lower reaches, is reducing. But there are two major messages in that. as we move from Indus Basin towards the Brahmaputra Basin, the overall contribution of snow and glacier melt is significantly reducing. So Indus Basin has approximately 60% of contribution, which is coming from snow and glacier melt. Ganga has slightly lower, around 20%, and slightly around 21-22% is coming into Brahmaputra Basin. So if you really look into this picture, most vulnerable basin under the climate change scenario is likely to be the Indus Basin, essentially because Ganga Basin likely to get more supplement water from monsoonal precipitation. Brahmaputra is also going to get more water from monsoonal precipitation, but Indus Basin is not going to get. So it appears to be more vulnerable for that. And this is a recent work with the last year was done by Mukherji et al. And I am a co-author in that work, which suggests that out of the various global basins, you can see here that a couple of basins which are located, such as Indus Basin or Abu Darya Basin or numerous other basins, they are most vulnerable. So let us understand why is that is vulnerable, even though we have a treaty between the India and Pakistan to share the water of Indus water, even though this basin initiates from China, but China is not part of this treaty and India is only part of this treaty. India and Pakistan is a part of this treaty, and this is a reasonably successful treaty because almost since it started from 1960s, for almost 60 years, this has somehow provided stability in sharing water between the India and Pakistan. So if you look into this treaty, overall treaty is grouped into two categories. One is the Eastern River Basin and another is the Western River Basin. So here you can see Satluj, Beas and Ravi. These are the three basins which is Eastern River Basin, and the water which is exclusively available for India. And the remaining basins such as Chenab, Jhelum and Indus, Upper Indus Basin, which is exclusively allotted to Pakistan. Some of that water can be used in India because of there are some provisions in treaty to do that. So if you really look into the original distribution of water in 1960s, you can see that Eastern River mean annual flow is 33 million acre feet and Western basins have 80 million acre feet. So approximately 30% of flow is only allotted to India and 70% of flow which is generated in this region is allotted to the Pakistan. That is how original treaty is all about. But when the treaty was done, at that time there was no understanding about the glaciers because glaciers understanding only came when I published my first atlas of glaciers in Himalaya in 1991. So you can see here is there. If you look into the Eastern River and Western River Basin here, the amount of glaciers substantially higher stored into the Eastern River Basin, which is allotted to Pakistan than to the India. So you can see now almost 95% glacial stored water is in Eastern Basin and only 5% of water stored in the Western River Basin. Even though India is allotted 30% of total water of the basin, but the glacial stored water in this basin is only 5% and 95% water is in Eastern River Basin. So this is one of the issues, but you also have to look into what is the current mass loss. The eastern rivers are located in much lower altitude and they receive a lot of dust which is generated onto the Indo-Gangetic plain. So they are losing mass at much more higher rate. You can see here that the glaciers which are located into the Chenab, into the Satluj basins are losing mass at the rate of almost a meter per year. But if you go into the Karakoram, there is still glaciers, large glaciated terrain, which is almost positive mass balance, slightly positive mass balance, but very close to the stability. So there is a differential loss in the mass balance. and taking place into these basins. And if you look into the 2090, if we have projected this model, and we suggest that by the end of century, the lower basins, which is Western River basins, will almost lose 85% glacier area, and the basins which are allotted to Pakistan will lose only 35% geographical area. And the great melt will start after the middle of century. And there was earlier talk about the much more higher melt will take place initially. So if you look into the lower altitude or Western River basin, the great melt has already started. And the great melt is not even started in the Karakoram region, which is expected to start sometime after the middle of century. So there's going to be some sort of differential availability of water in this basin. So how we are going to address this issue in future, which may come after the middle of century, we really need to discuss and understand this issue. So these are the major issues on which I want to talk, and I would like to stop here, and later on we can discuss this issue in much more detail. So thank you very much for this.
Anil, thank you very much. That was a fascinating expose, I think it was, the detail of the glaciers. But just give me how much can we afford to lose of these glaciers over what period of time? I mean, just give it a top line of that.
No, if say we have some study. So absolutely, we cannot afford to lose glaciers when it comes to the Karakoram region, even though it is not losing much. But that is essentially because there's no precipitation there coming from monsoon. Most of the precipitation is coming from western disturbances, and it is glaciers which is substantially contributing water. So the Karakoram mountain range is a very crucial because that provides water towards the Pakistan side. And if there's a substantial loss in area takes place there, or any loss in area takes there, that is going to have a problem. As far as Indian side is concerned, there is a substantial change in the seasonality will take place. It means that whatever water is now available in springtime, and that is a problem because that is going to come in winter time. So you are definitely going to have a gap between the availability of water from snow and arrival of monsoon. So that is going to be a seasonality gap in between that. That means we require much smarter way to store the water and much smarter way to utilize that water. So the supply side is going to change, but the demand side has to be done much more smarter way now. There's a smart agriculture management or smart water management is the key now on this.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Sterana, anybody that's got any questions on this crucial topic, because my learning curve is going up like that with every presentation. I'm sure yours is too. Ask the panelists, challenge the panelists if you think they've got it wrong. Put it in the comments. We have some already that we're putting up on the screen, and I hope that at the end we can get around to addressing some of those with some of the panelists. Our next speaker is Dipak Gyawali, Academician of Water Resources of Nepal and the Nepal Academy of Science and Technology, and a former chair of the Nepal Water Conservation Foundation. He's going to explain to us the 6 types of Himalayan water, all designated by a separate color, and all it seems bringing with it a separate problem. Dipak Gyawali, please explain.
Thank you. Basically, what I'm going to do is talk about the drivers behind the Himalayan water crisis. And to do that, I'll first have to step back to ask what is the crisis, and then talk about the primary drivers. And I would argue that, what we think are drivers are not really the drivers. There's something more insidious going on. And finally, we'll talk about the possible way out of this crisis. This is a very wicked problem, not easily solvable. So when we talk about drivers behind the Himalayan water crisis, we have to first talk, is it natural climate change? Yes, to some extent. And then wash our hands off it and wait for COPs and IPCCs to solve it. Okay. Climate change, I argue, has become a very convenient narrative. It's there, it's happening, don't get me wrong. But for policy folks, politicians and others, it helps them look nice and really not address the real here and now drivers behind the water crisis in the Himalaya, Nepal in particular. I argue that it is maldevelopment, mismanagement and misuse of technology, and oftentimes bad science that's leading to this water crisis. And climate change is just going to make it worse. Okay, so to use a Nepali expression, climate change is like a boil on top of a bad goiter. It's that big goiter that's the problem. Well, on top of that, you've got a boil now. Okay, so when we address this issue, we have to first step back and ask, what is the crisis? The obvious answer is lack of adequate water. Okay, in villages, in cities, for industries, for a whole lot of other things. Okay, now to answer that, one has to deconstruct water and its development. We have to step back. I argue that there are 6 types of water in the Himalaya, each one already facing a very, unique crisis of its own. Okay, first is the white water, cryosphere, as Kulkarni would tell us. It's the water in the atmosphere, the atmospheric moisture, the clouds, the patterns of cloud movement and moisture movement. What is happening is that there is quite obvious that there is something increasing anomalies of weather, weather anomalies going on. It's poorly understood. We do not know why there is bigger and more frequent cloud bursts, why there are unseasonal droughts even in the middle of the monsoon, but it's very poorly understood. And there is not much money or policy attention to the white waters. It's one of the, the sciences on the margins, to tell you the truth. This is where actually we should be focusing more as a region, because this is one transboundary water, the white water, that really recognizes no boundaries whatsoever. Okay. Then there is the green water. Green water is the water that has precipitated from the white water, is the soil moisture. All our forests, all our grasslands, all our non-irrigated agriculture, what we call dryland agriculture, is dependent on this green water, the soil moisture. Okay. It's also facing a crisis right now of greater desiccation. And as earlier speakers mentioned, with the higher temperature rise, average temperature rise in the higher mountain areas than in the plains, there is greater desiccation going on. And with this greater desiccation, you end up with things like more forest fires, greater destruction all around, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that is that other crisis with the green water. Okay, then there is the brown water. It's the white water that has fallen on soil and has percolated into the groundwater, the brown water. Now, this is facing a very different crisis. It's the biggest storage of water we have in South Asia and in the Himalaya. All our springs are really nothing but, groundwater in the mountains that are leaking. Mountains leak like a sieve. Those are our springs. And there are different types of springs, permanent springs, seasonal springs, and so on. Okay. And because of the massive over pumping of groundwater, even in the mountains, not just in the plains, mind you. Okay. There's huge pumping. I mean, I've seen resorts on top of hills, and of course, resorts you build on hills. You want to see the mountains. You want to have tourists come there and all that. You can't build a resort on a valley bottom. The trouble is, water flows down. It doesn't stay on that hilltop. So resorts are resorting to all kinds of very questionable means of buying out because they have the economic clout, poor villagers of their spring sources. They're also drilling. And there are cases where resorts have drilled from the top of a mountain 300, 400 meters below to pump groundwater. Now, when that happens, what happens is you end up drying up all the springs in between in all the villages. Okay, so this is that other crisis that's facing the Himalayan waters. Of course, blue water, lots of the talk has already been done about that. It's the water in the rivers and the lakes and so on. The trouble here is very different. It's captured by hegemons. Now, the hegemons can be, big, powerful states, or more often than not, it is cities that are colonizing the resources and waters of the hinterland, and also, iconic industries backed by governments that are also colonizing resources in the rural hinterlands, and so this is leading to its own kind of crisis. Okay, and then finally there are two other types of water, which is grey water, which is the water mostly from kitchens and things like that and toilets, which is organic. And the nice thing about grey water, if that word can even be used, is that it is because it is mostly organic, it's easily recyclable. Okay, sometimes nothing has to be done. I mean, these waters can just be sent in the farms, and there's a natural process of recycling going on, or with some minimum artificial recycling, you can get water good enough to be put back into the stream or used for other purposes. The big problem is black water. This is water that is extremely polluted by industrial pollutants with very highly toxic chemicals, and also water that is polluted by agriculture through indiscriminate use of pesticide. We have mountain villages where we've been studying this, where there are pockets of great prosperity because of vegetable farming. People used to have dryland farming of maize and potatoes or a few things like that before, but now they've gone heavily into vegetable farming, which is earning a lot of money. And because most men folk are out migrated either to India or the Gulf or the cities of Nepal, it's mostly women in the villages who do this, and they're making a lot of money. But because of the indiscriminate use of fertilizer, and even sometimes pesticides. Many cases there are fertile pesticides that are banned elsewhere, but come under very funny branding names, and people are using it. We're seeing cases of even young girls as young as 12 years old getting cancer. Okay, now this itself is also a major water crisis because this pesticide is polluting the Kulkarni reservoir. The fish catch there has reduced from 50 tons to about 6 tons a year now, and so on. So, this is also a waterborne water crisis. Okay, so when you look at this, each one of these crises is very, very specific to very specific nature of water and very specific nature of the human society and others that are using that water, whether it is green water, whether it's blue water, whether it is brown groundwater. They're all being used and misused in their own way. Okay, now climate change is going to exacerbate all that. So my basic argument I'm making here is that yes, climate change is there, it's a serious stuff, it's a global problem, so on and so forth. But if we do not address the here and now drivers of maldevelopment that we humans are responsible for, climate change is just going to make things much worse. And this washing of hands by policymakers of the here and now drivers, which are very difficult to address because you've got to blame yourself, okay, and your own institutions and so on. So climate change becomes a very nice excuse, to say, oh, it's all climate change. And that is a big problem. Now, to add to all this, the other drivers, the drivers that are adding to this problem are modernity-induced stress. And that stress has gone into the level of insult in many cases. And what is modernity-induced this thing? We have traditional water uses and traditional water harvesting schemes and, things like, ponds and the stone water spouts of Kathmandu Valley, 1500 years old and things like that. They're all being, sidelined and in, they're completely being degraded. And we're going for a new kind of system, including our waste management system, which is based on the flushing property of water. You dump them in the river and the river will flush it away. Okay, so we pollute our rivers with black and gray water. And so it's a technological misuse. I mean, you go to the high mountain areas where there are these fancy resorts coming up from for tourists, and there is one up in the near Mount Everest area, which has got this fancy toilets for very rich paying $500 a night tourists. Okay, the trouble is those toilets freeze solid in the winter, and to get them functioning for these high price paying tourists, juniper that takes 40 years to grow are being cut to boil the water to flush the toilet. Okay, now these are perversities that are coming up with what we would call bad examples of modernity. Okay, it's also changing social mores about our relation to water. Some of these technical artifacts that we had traditional had social mores associated with this. Particular time of the year when the whole community went there and collected the water and did all kinds of things, and changed, cleaned the ponds and so on and so forth. All that is dying out. Okay, so if you look at these primary drivers, there's the other one now. One of the biggest driver of Himalayan water crisis is the one that's most forgotten. It's verticality. You may be within, let's say, 10 meters or so from a major snow-fed river. The trouble is you are 500 or 1500 meter up. So that, great Himalayan river next to you 10 meters away below the cliff is useless. You can't use it. You can't carry water 1500 meters up and down every day. And the cost of pumping is extremely high. The energy cost of it is very high. So ultimately, this verticality crisis of water has been with us for a long time. But now because of our increased demand, for vegetable farming, for flush toilets and things like that, even in villages, you find out that the water crisis becomes a water energy food crisis, a nexus crisis. Okay. So now what are these primary drivers? Now, before we address what are the primary drivers, we've got to address what were the wrong drivers that we pursued over the last 50 years. There was a famous conference in New York in 1986. I was there. In the Mohonk, it's called the Mohonk Conference. It's a nice place, the Mohonk sort of a mountain resort. And all the watershed scientists of the world had gathered there. And it was an amazing conference because the theory of Himalayan degradation, that it is these poor fecund Himalayan farmers who are going higher up in the Himalayas and cutting trees and causing flood in Bangladesh, was shown to be scientific nonsense. That first of all, even if all of Nepal or the Himalaya was a canopy of trees, the amount of landslides we get even in forested areas is going to be the same because Himalayas are very steep. The material they are made out of is about as steep as it can get. And with the intense rainfall, what we have natural, normal, mass wasting or landslides. Okay, Himalayas are supposed to have something like 30% of the whole world's landslides going on. And if that mass wasting was not there, today you would not have much of Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, or Bengal, or Bangladesh. It would be the Tethys Sea. Okay, so it is a natural process. Let's not forget. Second, when Himalayan population, there's excess population, too many brothers in a farm, and they can't divide the farm. They don't go uphill, because there's nothing uphill. There's rock and snow. Okay, they go downhill to the cities, to India, to the Gulf to find alternative employment. So this idea that the Himalayan crisis was caused by population explosion and farmers cutting trees have been shown that it's not true. It's commercial farming that caused the deforestation. And
I interrupt for a second because we're very tight for time, and there's a question that's come in that I really want to put to you on this, and we can move on a bit. It's from Margaret Berry, and I wanted to you because you were the former Minister of Water Resources. Since climate change is subject to so much uncertainty, what effect might this have on environmental and socio-economic policy making? Can you give us encapsulated an answer for us on that?
As I said, it's important. Climate change is happening, but unfortunately, it is sidelined. It does not really form. There are nice policy statements, but in practice, things are moving in the opposite direction. I'll give you an example of Nepal. our climate policy is so good, I have argued that, Nepal should be given a Nobel Prize on climate policy. But if you looked at the practice, our fossil fuel addiction is rising like nobody's business. And this is true across the global south. So climate change is important. There's no doubt about it. And I'm one of those in Nepal who've been studying this for a long time. But when you look at the social implications, the policy implications of this, there's a huge question mark, And I can be cynical in saying that, climate change issues are limited to 1 week when the COP happens, and after that, everybody forgets about it.
Okay, thank you.
This is the problem. Okay.
And thank you for a great insight that you gave us there. And Aditi Mukherji makes the point, our next panelist, that climate change is man-made and not natural. So I think that was that was something that you nuanced there, that it is something that human beings are responsible for, but it's different to some of the other elements that we're discussing here. Aditi Mukherji, principal researcher, the International Water Management Institute in New Delhi, is an expert in climate change adaptation, political ecology, and that nexus between water, energy, and food. She is going to focus on some of the recent findings from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Hindu-Kush Himalayan assessment on the impact of climate change in the region. So Aditi Mukherji, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Humphrey, and thank you for inviting me to this amazing forum. And it's always a hard act to follow Dipak's presentation, but I will try my best. I'm going to present some of the latest findings from both the IPCC and the Hindu-Kush Himalayan assessment, both of which I was involved in as a scientist, and actually kind of take the focus a bit away from the Himalayas per se and look at the causes of climate change. And yes, I do differ a little bit. I agreed with everything that Dipak had to say about all those other developmental paradigms that is putting us where we are, but those development paradigms have also caused climate change. So I would again like to reiterate that climate change is not natural. Climate change is anthropogenic, as the latest IPCC reports have shown. I don't want to repeat a lot of what my other co-panelists have said, but the big picture is that human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that's unprecedented in the last 2,000 years. This is from the summary for policymakers for the working group 1 of the IPCC, and it really shows that it's just the last 150 years have shown a huge amount of warming, and we are already, climate change is not something that will happen in the future. We are already in a 1.1 degree world, and the impacts are very clear. And actually some of the countries like Nepal, for instance, who have hardly emitted anything, are at the forefront of climate impact. So I think it's important to know that we are already living in a climate changed world. Often the word climate change has this this future meaning that climate will change, but actually we need to redo that terminology and say that climate has changed. And this was very well proven in this particular report. Again, the same report shows that hot extremes are increasing in almost all regions. This is a stylized map of the world with studies from all the regions. And we can see that for South Asia as a whole, there is a high confidence of extreme hot events. And as you all know, and we have been seeing in the news report, we just are emerging from a prolonged heat wave that has been unprecedented in several ways in the region. Similarly, there is observed changes in heavy precipitation. It's been seen across the world. In South Asia also, we see that there is an increase in observed heavy precipitation since the 1950s. Now, this is like a global picture, and what we are also seeing is that various projections are showing that these things just become more and more intense at a higher level of warming. Compared to a 1.5 degree world to a 4 degree world. And we are currently, whatever our global climate pledges are, as per the last COP that happened in Glasgow, we are headed towards a 2.7 to 3 degrees world. And that would be actually mean a lot more heating in the Himalayas, as Professor Kulkarni rightly pointed out, due to elevation dependent warming. Now, what is this large global picture? What does it actually mean for South Asia and more importantly for the Himalayas? And this is something that we did an assessment as a part of the Hindu Kush Himalayas, and some of us present here, including Professor Kulkarni, was a part of that as well. So one of the main messages of that Hindu, and also MP Barry Gardiner mentioned this assessment at the beginning of his talk. The main conclusion that this assessment did was, even let's assume that the world can remain with 1.5 degrees, which we know it cannot. As I just mentioned, the last COP commitments, those were just commitments, not actual implementations. Shows that we are on a pathway from 2.7 to 3 degrees. Hopefully our commitments will improve as will implementation of mitigation. But even with a 1.5 degree world, it's too hot for the Himalayas, simply because it's amplified by elevation dependent warming. So what it means that HKH, that's the Hindu Kush Himalayas, the whole region from all the way to Afghanistan to Myanmar and everything in between, will warm more rapidly at higher elevation. So anything between 2.5 plus minus 1.5 is expected under RCP 4.5. These are different scenarios. But overall, without going into too much detail, suffices to say that even by some miracle, the world is able to limit global warming to 1.5. Remember, we are already in 1.1 degree, and most scenarios are saying that there would be breach of 1.5 as soon as by the middle of next century. But let's assume that we get our act together, mitigation goes really fast. Even then, 1.5 would be too hot for the Himalayas. What does it mean then? It means that in a 1.5 degree world, it is projected that Himalayan glaciers are projected to lose up to 1/3 of the glacial volume by 2100. If we breach that and reach at a 2 degree global warming, if the global warming stabilizes at that also means a loss of almost 50% of global ice volume. These are huge. I mean, we are talking of huge loss in ice and glacier volume. This means loss of cultural heritage, not only more of the tangible of water, tangible value of water, but also the whole intangible value of water in terms of religion, culture, just the way of living will be lost. So yeah, and we have already heard the various implications on water in terms of runoff peak that will happen around the middle of the century, etc. What do these changes mean for the river region's water resources? I have kept it relatively simple here, in the sense I don't have a lot of slides, but previous speakers have covered that well. So this is a picture from 2009. This is a site courtesy of Easy Mode, where I used to work earlier. So if you keep, this somehow didn't quite work. There was supposed to be a animation. Okay, never mind. I'll go to the next one. And I wanted to bring in one aspect around the climate justice issue. Himalayas is actually one of those areas. Himalayas, high mountains, not only Himalayas, but many other high mountains, particularly Himalayas, because here the level of vulnerability is very high. Along with also the small island developing states, which are actually likely to see hard limits of adaptation. Basically, how do you adapt when the resource on which your livelihood depends simply vanishes? An example is this particular village in Ladakh, which depends on these glaciers. You can see how dry and arid this kind of environment is, but in between you have these green verdant valleys, and they derive their irrigation from those far away kind of glaciers that you see. And there is an intricate system of dating back to thousands of years that have a very detailed both physical systems, but also socio-cultural and human institutional systems that brings water from those distant glaciers and provides irrigation to these villages. And increasingly, it's been hard to sustain these kind of agricultural economies in these small villages, simply because the glaciers are melting faster than before, or there isn't enough meltwater that reaches on time during when they require this water. And we did work in these communities, and they were like, okay, so what can we do? And the reality is that they can do very little. They are doing all that they can do. They're migrating, they're moving to other occupations, to tourism and all of that. But the reality is that the real cause of climate change, they were not responsible for it. They have hardly any carbon footprint. Their lives are really low carbon pathway lives, and they are the ones who have contributed the least to carbon emissions and are facing one of the most severe impacts. I just wanted to also focus the discussion. There's a lot that the region can do, and my previous speakers have really talked in detail about some of those actions. I mean, just maldevelopment, the development pathways that we have followed simply does not cater to the requirements, particularly in a fragile environment like the Himalayas, and that's compounding the problems. But I think given that climate change is real and happening now and is disproportionately affects these communities who have had very little contribution to that climate change, I think there is a lot that the global community can do. And this is what the IPCC reports are being very unequivocal in saying, that if we hope to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees, this has to be the decade of very fast mitigation. It's basically mitigate now, decarbonize all sectors. And the largest responsibility actually lies with the historical emitters who have caused the current climate change. And that's certainly not Nepal, for instance. So there is that huge role that the global community has to solve this Himalayan water crisis, because in some ways the Himalayan water crisis has been caused by climate change, which is a global thing, caused by, again, development pathways that has led us to very high, consumptive kind of lifestyle and high carbon emission lifestyle, which has ultimately affected every region, including the regions which do not have these kind of lifestyles, like, again, some of the remote parts of Himalayas. The second part is around adapt as much as you can, and the reality is that space for adaptation. Our chapter in the working group 2 report on water, we are showing that the space for adaptation becomes seriously constrained between once we move beyond 1.5 to 2 degrees. And in some of the places, as I mentioned, high mountains and in the small developing islands, actually limits to adaptation are being met. I mean, basically, how do you adapt when your livelihoods depends on glacier melt and those glaciers vanish? There is no way you can adapt to such a situation, and any adaptation then kind of has, a lot of negative implications on your cultural heritage, livelihoods, etc. And it's important both. What it then means is that mitigation and adaptation are both equally important. Adaptation may not be even possible in some instances in some of these regions, but those have to be underpinned by this entire concept of just transition, mitigate and adapt, keeping in mind climate justice. And the extremely important role of finance is extremely important, and I think the next COP has a quite a lot of discussions around that. So I just would like to finish with this important message that comes from the 1.5 degree report of the IPCC, and it really resonates, is that every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice matters. Not only the choice of the people in the region, which is important, but also the choice of the global community, particularly global north, which has been frankly responsible for the current climate change. And also our region itself, with two of the large emitters, India and China, also urgently needs to move to more low emission carbon pathways, and that requires both technology as well as finances. So basically, so it's not, the Himalayan water crisis has not been entirely caused in the region. So there is this, this global aspect to it. So I will just stop there and thank you. Back to you, Humphrey.
Thank you, Aditi. That was quite grim. 1.5 is too hot. 2 is disastrous. Can I put to you a question from one of our audience? How can necessary infrastructure development take place in this region while still sustaining supplies of fresh water and supporting dependent ecosystems? Are the two compatible? Just a top line answer, one sentence, if you can do it.
Yeah, I think and here the infrastructure, a lot of the infrastructure has been around hydropower. We really need to ask this question right now. Hydropower cost is one of the highest in India. If I remember right, according to my memory, maybe electricity produced from hydropower is around 7 to 8 rupees per unit, while the cost of producing electricity from solar is as cheap as 2 rupees per unit. So right now, solar is one of the cheapest. Then why do we continue to invest in hydropower and similar infrastructure in the Himalayas, where environment is so fragile, it is causing uprooting of local communities, etc. So yes, we need infrastructure. Yes, we need energy for all, but those can be actually also derived from low emission ways which are less environmentally destructive. So I would think that we do have to rethink our environment, our developmental paradigms, and the kind of development paradigms that has brought us here would not necessarily take us out of this crisis. So we have to really rethink of what development means and how to achieve that.
Okay, that's a good answer. Thank you very much for that. And we are now going to Dhondup Wangmo, who's a research fellow at the Tibet Policy Institute, going to be telling us about the third pole. That's the region that we heard from Barry Gardner that encompasses the Hindu Kush, the Himalayan mountain range, the Tibetan plateau, the ice fields, with this largest reserve of fresh water outside of the polar regions. And climate change on the Tibetan plateau is not just an Asian concern, it's a global concern, isn't it? So Dhondup Wangmo, tell us what you know. Hello?
Hello, can you see my slide?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and at the same time, good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Democracy Forum for highlighting the Himalayan water crisis, causes and effects, and at the same time allowing me to involve in today's discussion. Today, I'm focusing mainly on why the third pole matters, how the third pole play a crucial role in supplying the water support to more than 10 countries, and the impacts of the melting snow on the third pole. To begin with why does the third pole matter? First, we need to understand that the Tibetan Plateau with the surrounding mountain ranges, the Himalaya, Karakoram, Pamir, and Tanshan ranges, and Kunlun contain the largest mass of the frozen fresh water outside the two poles, known as the third pole. Asia's 10 major rivers are also flowing out from the Tibetan Plateau. Around 1.9 billion people depend upon the rivers directly for the fresh water supplies, and around 4 billion people, nearly half of the world's present population, rely upon the rivers either for agriculture or the industry. Now, coming to the main point, the significance of the third pole to the global climate change. The Tibetan Plateau has played a crucial role in Asia's water cycle, providing the water supply to the lower riparian countries. Not only the glaciers, but the snow and the permafrost are integral to the cryosphere and also balances the natural water flow. Before the Chinese invasion of the Tibet, industrialization, urbanization, and the rise in the population, the climate change in the Tibetan Plateau is constant with a high altitude and low temperature. During winter, ice accumulated, and during summer, the snow and the glaciers gradually melt. During the warmer days, the oceans evaporated to form the condensation into the clouds. These condensation fall back as snow and rain, especially at a higher altitude. The snow accumulated as the ice and gradually melt to give a fresh water supply and also the other necessitate to the most densely populated areas in the world and the source of the Asia's major rivers. So that is the symbol diagram that I tried to show it in a simpler form, how the precipitation and the temperature works in changing the quantity and quality of the glacier, snow melt, and the permafrost. At the present, The Tibetan Plateau is warming twice the rate at twice the global average. The minimum winter temperature has concurrently increased and therefore warmer days are longer than usual. The warmer temperature causes more water and land to evaporate, leading to more precipitation in form of the rain rather than a snow. This has further reduced snow cover and earlier a more rapid glaciers melting. The disruption of a stable hydrological regime that is a headwater of the rivers following from the Tibetan Plateau is mainly triggered by anthropogenic activities besides the climate change. Taking these into account, what I'm trying to say here is that the integrated effort from the all watershed countries needs to restore the cryosphere on the Tibetan Plateau. Such a climate change on the Tibetan Plateau will not only be problematic to Tibet alone, but impacts of it will also be seen in the downstream nation. Hence, to save the water availability in the rivers downstream, the climate change in the Tibetan Plateau should be taken as a global discussion. And this is the third point, how the third pole is regulating the ancient water supply and supplying the fresh water supplies to the downstream countries. In context with above discussion, Tibet's rivers are the lifeline of the Asia. Around 150 million people depend on the Yellow River, including Tibet and China. For instance, if I have to give you the example, I have taken the Mekong River as an example. For instance, the Mekong River alone provides river support to more than 70 million people in 6 countries in the Southeast Asia. It also supports the agriculture and fisheries industry. The annual cycle of the flooding causes the large flow reversal up the Tonle Sap River to the Great Lake in Cambodia, triggering the fish movement and nutrients to the floodplain. The Great Brahmaputra is also the lifeline of the Assam. Parts of the northern Pakistan and Ladakh have irrigation systems that depend solely on the glacier and snow melt from the Tibetan Plateau. In India and Pakistan, more than 100 million farmers depend upon irrigation water coming directly from the Indus and Ganges River rather than from their tributaries. So this is the impacts of the climate change on the third pole. My previous speaker Aditi have already stressed about it, but I'm stressing it again. According to Hindu Kush Himalaya assessment report, even with the increase in the global average temperature capped at 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels, glaciers in the region will lose one-third of their ice volume by the year 2100. And United Nations Environmental Program have even mentioned that 41% of the BC increase on the Tibetan Plateau have already seen, and two-thirds of the 70 million deaths due to air pollution in Asia, specifically in the surrounding mountain Asia. These all are the impacts of the climate change on the third pole and to the downstream countries. As I have already been mentioned, at present the Tibetan Plateau is undergoing a significant warming. According to the Hindu Kush Himalaya assessment, even with increase in the global average temperature gap at 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial level, glaciers in the region will lose one-third of the ice volume by the year 2100. Moreover, model simulations have predicted that even the global average temperature stabilizes at the 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level, at least 1.8 degrees Celsius of warming in the Himalayas and 2.2 degrees Celsius in the Karakoram will still occur. And not only that, its impact of it are becoming more prominent on the Tibetan Plateau. The glaciers' loss and retreat are highly accelerated at the third pole. ICMO 2019 report had also warned that if the warming remains the same, 45 to 63% of a glacier mass will be lost at the end of this century. Permafrost erosion is also a major consequence that can affect the water cycle, landslide, and the building infrastructure damage, and its a positive feedback will further contribute to the greenhouse gas warming. And for example, the landslide has been seen frequently on the Tibetan Plateau. Not only that, but the desertification is also expanded on the Tibetan Plateau. In terms of the social impact, there is a record of the forceful relocation of the Tibetan nomads in building the hydropower project on the rivers. Therefore, what I'm trying to sum up over here is that climate change in the Tibetan Plateau will change the river flow into the downstream countries and water dependency and threaten the livelihood as well as in Asia and beyond. And this is the real presentation, real image of the glacier melt in the Meteor book. And now coming to the last presentation, that what can we do to save the third pole? My first point is that how can we save the third pole? The first point is that giving importance to the ecological process vital for the sustenance of the mountain's ecosystem and natural hydrology conditions. And my second point is reducing the anthropogenic activities, which is causing the climate change on the third pole. And third, preference to the nature-based solutions and prioritize the natural system and their process. And third, China being the supreme power of the rivers following downstream, all involved countries should be integrated with China in combating the water crisis, and then to complete evaluation of the short and long-term benefit and the loss of any water-related project and comprehensive environmental impact assessment, for example, building hydropower projects. Irrespective of the political instability and power within the transboundary nations, water resources should be taken care as an ecological value rather than economic value. And in the name of the development, China's continued building dams had ignored the human rights, social and environmental impact. So hydropower projects should be built under the consensus from the local people. And addressing my last point is addressing the issue on the global level. Thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for that fascinating presentation there. And I just want to give you one question from one of our audience and answer it in 30 seconds. It's a huge question, but the question is, given that many companies in the Himalayan region are supported by Chinese government officials, what can be done to lessen negative impacts of Chinese mining or dam construction? Can you give that a go? I think you're muted.
That is true. The Chinese government is continue building the dams on the Tibetan rivers, right? And the Chinese government is practicing similarly unregulated mining. So that is the quite give a negative impact to the water, causes the water pollution. So what we can do is that the Tibetan Plateau and the surrounding mountain ranges, the other countries who share the water can pressurize China to have to make a policy or to make to communicate and to negotiate with all related countries to build a treaty or to build a framework, a policy with a certain consensus, with a certain norms, and that if we can follow that, I think the Chinese government built, they have to respect the what all if all the countries can pressurize to China, then they can do alternate solutions. Otherwise, China's being the supreme power position, they are always affecting the downstream nations.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And stay with us, because we are now going to our final panelist, Charles Iceland, Global Director of Water at the Water Resources Institute. And as part of his project, I don't know whether he's going to talk about this at all, he and his team have developed a machine learning, that's artificial intelligence conflict prediction tool that leverages information on environmental, political, and economic and various other conditions. But Charles is going to offer us a broad perspective on water security and global water risk, with some reference to the situation in the Himalayas and what it is leading to. So Charles, Iceland, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Humphrey. Thanks to Lord Bruce and the Democracy Forum for inviting me to speak. If you can bring up my PowerPoint, that would be great. Do you have the PowerPoint up? Because I'm not seeing it. Am I supposed to share my screen? Okay, let's see if I can share. Oops.
But well, you could do it without, Charles.
Sure. Why don't I just speak to the slides I was going to present? And basically, I just wanted to talk about a number of the different types of water risks that we are facing as a global community. We have, first of all, the problem that in a lot of places, including parts of India, Pakistan, Central Asia, Northern China, places we're talking about here today, we're using far too much water to irrigate our crops, for drinking, for our ever-growing cities, for our industry. We're using too much water relative to what we have naturally from rainfall. And so that's leading to very high levels of water stress around the world, but particularly in the regions that we're talking about here in Asia. On top of those, that relatively chronic type of risk, we also face episodic risks. So drought risk, for example. So on top of the fact that India uses more water than it should be, sometimes, fairly frequently, it's facing drought conditions, which puts even more pressure on water resources there. On top of the problems with water scarcity, we have a problem of water quality. Other speakers have referred to the problem of untreated wastewater being dumped in Asian rivers and surface water, which eventually contaminates groundwater. There's also the big problem of contamination from farm runoff, from phosphorus and nitrogen from the fertilizer we use. And that also creates very big problems for water quality. On top of that, we need to add the fact that a lot of the poorest segments of the populations in Asia and in the rest of the developing world, people don't have access to water treatment facilities. Usually in the United States or Europe, we don't take our water directly from the river. Instead, we have water treatment facilities that abstract that water, clean it to drinking water standards, and then pipe it into our homes. But a lot of people in Asia, of course, don't have that. They have to walk long ways to fetch water from either lakes or streams, and that water is full of contaminants and pathogens. Then, of course, we have the problem of too much water, and we have floods of various types. We have river floods, which is what happens when we have excessive rainfall and rivers overflow their banks and flood the surrounding territory. We have floods from the ocean associated with hurricanes and typhoons, and they push water into coastal areas, where many of these coastal areas are very heavily populated. And then we have, with climate change, increasing problem associated with what we call flash flooding. So we have basically very heavy rainfall events in cities, and those heavy rainfall events are overwhelming the city's drainage capabilities. And so we get flooding from these heavy rainfall events in many neighborhoods that flood, destroying homes, destroying other property, and wreaking havoc on city life and livelihoods. We know with our flood risk modeling that two things are going to lead to very much increasing flood risks in the future. The first is due to socioeconomic change. So with growing populations, we are having more and more people building homes and other infrastructure in harm's way. We are also seeing bigger storms associated with climate change, and that's leading to bigger flood events. And so we've calculated at the World Resources Institute that annual urban damages in India will increase about 15-fold in the period between 2010 and 2030 due to socioeconomic change and due to climate change. And so what are some of the impacts of these various water stresses? Well, first of all, as has been pointed out by earlier speakers, India, for example, is pumping way too much water out of the ground, especially in the northwestern part of the country where that's their breadbasket. And so they're pumping water out faster than rainfall can replenish those aquifers. And those aquifer levels are falling. We also have throughout the world increasing pressure on cities from ever worsening droughts. In 2015, the Sao Paulo region of Brazil, which has about 40 million people, almost ran out of water. And there was talk that maybe the military would need to be brought in to maintain order. Fortunately, the worst was averted and rains came and provided relief before the city ran out of water. The same thing happened in Cape Town, South Africa in 2018. They almost ran out of water. And they even set a day that they called Day Zero, when they thought they would have to shut off the taps to city residents. Fortunately, that catastrophe was averted. Chennai, India, which is India's 6th largest city, wasn't so lucky. They actually ran out of water in June of 2019 and had to depend on water tanker trucks and railway cars to bring water in to just provide those bare necessities to the city inhabitants, the drinking water they needed, water for cooking and basic sanitation and hygiene, and that's all. And I think that situation lasted for a few months until the monsoon rains came to alleviate the problem. We have problems with very fast-growing populations in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's causing a lot of pressure on water resources that are either in fixed amount or they're declining, and so you have situations where pastoralists and farmers are coming into violent conflict with one another over these ever more scarce water and land resources. We're seeing these conflicts in places like Darfur. We're seeing it on the other side of Africa, in Mali. And then we have geopolitical problems between nations over water sharing. Ethiopia has just finished building Africa's largest dam, which is called the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam. And this dam is across the Blue Nile. And 85% of the water that makes its way along the Nile to Egypt originates in the Ethiopian highlands. And so the construction of this dam, and it's currently being filled, is of great political consternation in Egypt. And this isn't the only place that's happening. It's happening as Turkey's damming up water and slowing down flows to downstream Iraq. It's happening, well, of course, there's the Indus Treaty that's been mentioned, but there's a lot of geopolitical tension between India and Pakistan over the sharing of those waters, or between India and China over potential damming high up in the Himalayan region. And then we're seeing the impacts of flooding. In 2019, Cyclone Idai submerged huge areas of Mozambique, creating an inland ocean over large swaths of Mozambique. Millions of people lost all their possessions, their livelihoods, their farms were flooded, their herds were decimated. And similar things happened in Bangladesh in 2020 when monsoon rains inundated a third of that country. And we had similar flooding associated with hurricanes Eta and Iota in Central America. And large populations of farmers had to evacuate those areas. Some were forced to migrate to nearby cities. Some decided to try to immigrate illegally to the United States in search of livelihoods. And last but not least, I want to talk about the contribution of these ever worsening droughts and floods on our food security globally. We're in the midst of an unprecedented global food price spike. This hasn't been seen, I don't know, even going back to the early 60s, these level of prices. And of course, that's a recipe for unrest and food insecurity. And even in places like Afghanistan and the Horn of Africa, large-scale famine. And so, well, with that, I want to turn it back to Humphrey. And sorry for not being able to share my slides, but thank you. Oh, there are my slides. Belatedly. I think you're on mute, though, Humphrey.
Yes, thank you so much, Charles. Now, your slides did appear, but you were doing so well without them and being so clear that I thought, let's just leave it, and we could go through it because all sorts of technical things might have cropped up. Could I give you? I've got a question to follow up, but I want to give you a question for our audience here, which encapsulates a little bit of what you said. What measure? This is from Amit Rama. What measures might be taken within international law to deal with the politicization of water?
Well, you know, there are treaties, international treaties that govern the use of water across country boundaries. And, you know, we discussed the Indus River Treaty, which is very important in maintaining, you know, trying to keep a lid on some of these simmering problems. But there are lots of places around the world where you don't have such treaties. You don't have a good treaty on the Nile. You don't have a meaningful treaty to govern the Tigris-Euphrates. So the first thing that nations have to do is to really come together and devise rules for divvying up the water in these basins.
Yes, that's and just you actually do have an artificial intelligence software program that just tell us a touch about that.
Sure. Well, we have a project that's part of this Water, Peace, and Security Consortium that we're a part of, along with 5 European organizations. And what we've developed is we've taken, we've experimented with 200 global data sets. Some of them have to do with water and climate change, some with food security and energy availability, but some are also more traditional conflict prediction indicators, such as wealth and the nature of the political systems that are in place, and governance. And so we take all those variables, some of them are in near real time, and try to predict places where we're likely to see conflict over the coming 12 months. Goodness. And this AI prediction model works well in certain circumstances, not as well in other circumstances. We've had fun so far developing it, and we're trying to make it better. But yeah, it's our first foray into trying to use AI to forecast some of these wicked problems.
And can people access it through the website, or
Absolutely.
is it?
Absolutely. If you Google water, peace, and security, that should steer you to our website, and you'll click on the part of the website that says global tool, and you'll be able to see it.
Right.
And it's free for anybody to use.
Yes, I was taken by the what you said about we're all using too much water. I mean, I think that's and because some years ago, I did a report from the Aral Sea, which was drained off into nothing because they used the water for cotton, to grow cotton. So,
Yes.
you know, that there is that thing. But we are out of time for our panel, and you still have time to ask a question if any, excuse me, if anybody's got a question to ask. But for the moment, we're going over to Lord Charles Bruce, the president of the Democracy Forum, to assess where this Democracy Forum debate has taken us and what new ground we have broached.
Thank you, Humphrey. Well, I've just actually Googled the Water, Peace and Security Partnership, which Charlie Iceland mentioned, and I think that's possibly the place to start, right at the very end of the webinar, because it's ultimately the politicization of water, which is the recurring theme, I think, throughout most of our presentations. And it's fascinating that there is a predictive tool. Just very briefly summarizing Charles Iceland's presentation, what the main concern really is the combination of a chronic risk and an episodic risk of water supply, and the fact that there's such a serious problem with water quality as well as water supply. And it's the socioeconomic consequences of that, which many of the speakers have addressed this afternoon, where there's a question of too much water, with flooding and the overwhelming of city drainage systems, the consequential urban damage, which Charles Iceland told us in India will increase 15-fold by the end of the century, is a very serious problem. And I think it's an impact which, although emanating obviously in the Himalayan plateau, is affecting communities downstream. He mentioned, in fact, 3 cities which have been seriously affected in the last 7 years, including Cape Town and Chennai, both of whom narrowly averted a serious problem of water shortage. This theme was obviously highlighted in the very beginning of our session this afternoon by the pre-recorded introduction which Barry Gardner gave us. And Barry's predominant theme really is that it's a complex series of natural problems which will clash with geopolitical issues. And that really is the theme which many of the speakers return to. Barry reminded us that there are 54,000 glaciers feeding the key river systems of South Asia, and over 1.9 billion people are dependent on this water supply. He often referred to the Hindu Kush and Himalayan assessment, which was quite an important document which other speakers also referred to, which estimates how rivers will swell and will diminish alarmingly by mid-century, a problem obviously which is being exacerbated by climate change. Barry focused very much on China's responsibility in much of this conundrum, mostly of course because China controls Tibet, and the fact that China needs to develop a more consensual approach to facing these issues with other countries in the region. That's an issue which many speakers return to throughout the webinar. Barry introduced some quite interesting ideas on hydrodiplomacy and mentioned the deep wells of mistrust which continue to strain relations. And these deep wells of mistrust certainly were returned to by other speakers. I was very interested in Paromita Ghosh's paper, where she focused very much on the impact on small communities in the Himalayan areas, where there's a striking loss of spring water. She was talking about the city in her study, Almora, which has lost 250 springs in 30 years, forcing a typical housewife now to walk 45 minutes to collect a single pail of water. These consequences for small communities in areas affected, I think, need to be taken into greater consideration. Her solution was for a campaign for spring rejuvenation, for watershed planning and proper water resource management. These initiatives were referred to by other speakers as well. Dipak Gyawali introduced an idea of 6 different water types, which made an absolutely fascinating study, from white water, green water, brown water, blue water, grey and black water. His concern is that most of the crisis that we've been talking about today has been obscured by an obsession with climate change, whereas the issue concerning water quality in the way that he described it often is a problem which can be addressed more closely by communities acting more sensibly. And in fact, he referred to climate change as the bad boil on top of a goiter, a Nepali phrase which he emphasized a great deal. That presentation led on to Aditi Mukherji, who had introduced for us the IPCC 1.5 degree report, which emphasized that climate change, of course, is not a natural process, and it's the human influence on climate change over the last 150 years, which is unprecedented in the last 2,000 years. This is something that she focused on very much and suggested that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact in the West that we're historically responsible for so much of global warming. And that's an impact which has been felt by the most vulnerable communities, as we've discussed. She introduced this idea that if we are unable to maintain global warming to 1.5 degrees by 2100, by the end of this century, then we will lose at least 1/3 of the volume of our glaciers. And if that increase in temperature is at 2 degrees, we're going to lose almost 1/2. That is probably the most stark warning I think any of the speakers gave today, and it's one which I think is the most important one to take away from this webinar. I was interested very much in Anil Kulkarni's description of the cryosphere and the overall climate impact of climate change on the Himalayas, where there's a loss of snow cover up to 85%, driving the incidence of early forest fires in the spring, exacerbating further melting, the vulnerability of mountain streams, and where 75% of the Indus region water is derived from glacial snowmelt. He introduced this idea of the great inequity of the Indus Water Treaty, dividing the water rights access between India and Pakistan, that provides over 70% of glacial flow to Pakistan and less than 30% to India, again suggesting that this is going to be a major issue for conflict, which Charles Iceland's conflict prediction tool, I think, needs to be very much focused in this part of the Himalayas. And finally, we were again given a very good and very concise summary by Dhondup Wangmo of the Hindu Kush Himalayan assessment, which Barry had introduced at the very beginning, again indicating that China has a great deal of responsibility for the management and depletion of the third pole. Thank you very much.
For that. And we are right on the hour. So we are out of time, as they say. What a brilliant debate that we've had. Thank you all for your presentations, and the comments and questions that came in. Thank you to our panel, Paromita Ghosh, Anil Kulkarni, Dipak Gyawali, Aditi Mukherji, Dhondup Wangmo, and Charles Iceland, for that insight, for your argument, for your persuasion. That 1.5 to 2 degrees, I think, as Charles Bruce said, is probably one of those chilling things that I'll take away from it. Please all join us next month, Tuesday, July the 6th. Taiwan, is it the key to the continuing world order? Hope to see you then. An equally fascinating panel. Until then, stay involved, stay safe, and goodbye. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.